Are we aligned? All right. So I can say hi to everybody on the stream. All right. So I don't have a microphone for you all. Amanda will have one, but I think my voice carries enough, hopefully, in the back. And we have feedback? No? Oh, good. All right. Perfect. Welcome to everyone. I'm so happy to see such a huge turnout in such a short time. So it's really awesome. The story is that Amanda wrote to me, I think, last Friday a week ago or something like that, and said, hey, I'll be in Switzerland, so let's organize a meetup. And we're like, yeah, sure, let's jump on it. So Amanda Silver is a corporate vice president with a developer division at Microsoft. So if you have worked with Microsoft, you probably heard about the DevDiv, right? The developer division. It's basically a mythical area. I'm not going to do the developer dance because you don't want to see that. But developers are everything to Microsoft, and the DevDiv is where they develop all the tools that we are using. Visual Studio, .NET, C#, Visual Studio Code, all the tools that are used for Azure integration, for Azure development, right? Azure functions, etc. So this is all basically Amanda's turf. So she's a person to know. Before we go further into her introduction, first of all, thank you to all the sponsors. And thank you so much to iSolutions for hosting us. Raphael is here. Say hi, Raphael. Raphael told me to tell you that there is drinks and beers at the back if you want. And this is, of course, free of charge. But thank you so much, Raphael, for hosting us and for organizing all this, as well as the catering short notice. So this is very, very much appreciated. We are the .NET user group of Switzerland. This is also a collaboration in the promotion with other user group, for example, the Azure user group of Zurich. Basically, what we do is organize events. Please check the meetup page. This is where you have all the events. There are regular events, sometimes smaller, sometimes bigger. Sharing the knowledge and the passion, and networking is very important, as you all know, right? Especially when you think about changing job, maybe, right? If you have met somebody in person, it's way easier to get in contact with those persons. And you can follow up on Twitter, LinkedIn. Also, the meetup group is basically where everything happens. All right, and if you want, by the way, speaking at a user group is a great way to get started with public speaking. That's how I got started 20 years ago, probably, by speaking at a user group. I still remember I had 5 people. And it was like, oh my God, I love this so much. I want to make my work, my profession out of it. And this is how, years later, I got hired at Microsoft to speak at conferences, basically. So if you want to try that out, we have a Sessionize place. If you don't know Sessionize, that's basically the major portal for conferences to propose or to recruit speakers, I would say. So you go on Sessionize, and then you can submit a proposal. And then if it's interesting or niche enough that nobody talked about it before, or maybe somebody did, but we want another view on the topic, then we are going to contact you and maybe organize something. And it could be the start of a great career in public speaking. So this is cool. All right, Amanda is here. Before I give Amanda the word, I just wanted to tell you something which is also falling under what Amanda is doing, which is how do you basically bring feedback on Microsoft products, right? And we have a number of possibilities and solutions. And the one thing I wanted to show you is in Visual Studio Code, and all those tools, but also, of course, on Azure. So if you are anywhere on Azure and something doesn't work like you want, we always have a feedback button here, in the top right, okay? Sometimes you need to look for it because maybe the screen is a little bit too small. So if I go here, this is an Azure function application. Maybe I need to click on the 3 dots, but there is always send us your feedback, right? And then you can enter some indications about what you did, what didn't work, what worked well, and then send it. And this is, I guarantee you, people will look at it, right? This is really a good way to get in touch. You can also say if it's okay for people to contact you about your feedback. It's at the bottom there. And like this, because of course you're logged into Azure with an account, so we know a little bit about you, just enough to contact you and ask you questions. So it's a great way to give feedback about our products. But we also have that in Visual Studio Code, for example. And so if you go here at the bottom, you can actually tweet your feedback, which is cool because you can shame the engineers who, no, you don't shame the engineers, sorry. But you can say, hey, I love this feature, or I didn't like it. It's a good way to get attention for sure. But there is also another thing that you can do. If you go under help here and then report issue, and that one is, I think it closed, no, it's here. That one is going to go directly into the GitHub repo as an issue in there, okay? And also this is a great way to get in touch with the engineering team and basically to get eyes on your issue and on your feedback, okay? So here, if you click, it will create the issue on GitHub. Now, the feedback solution we have in Visual Studio, in the big Visual Studio, as opposed to code, is even more extensive. And basically, if you go here on the button, you can also report a problem or even suggest a feature. So if you have something that you always wanted to have, you write, hey, I saw Amanda at the user group, like this is prioritized higher. That's how it works, right? No? And basically, if you say report a problem, the cool thing here is that it's going to include everything that the engineers need to analyze the issue and potentially reproduce it. So you enter a title, a description, and please be thorough with the description, okay? It doesn't work, it doesn't really help us to understand what doesn't work, but really step 1, I did this, step 2, this happened, and step 3, this is what I was expecting, okay? This is pretty much the standard way. And then after that, you can include a screenshot, and you see it took a screenshot of my environment, right? When I actually clicked the button, so it's convenient. But it's also, you can actually record a short video of what you did. If you can reproduce the issue, it's easier. It's also going to attach system logs and everything that is needed to basically analyze the issue. So please use those options because it's very useful. And I think, Amanda, you have some anecdotes about that as well that you can maybe share with us. So without further ado, I'm going to give the word to Amanda. And I'm going to unplug my laptop and you can plug yours, I believe, right?
Sounds
all right.
Great. Sounds great. Let me just make sure I have all of the right mics on. Hold on a second. Okay, thank you so much, Laurent.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you, everybody.
Do you want me to drop your laptop?
I will.
You will, okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Laurent, and thank you, everybody, all of the organizers for putting this on such short notice. As Laurent mentioned, I gave him the news about a week ago that I was coming to Switzerland to visit my sister. And hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could also have a user group or something like that while I'm here? I also have my nephews in the background, so I just need to, you guys want to wave real quick? They are coming to see me at work for the first time, so if I appear nervous, it's because they're here. But anyways, they are now getting into coding, and actually, one of them started with MakeCode, started to use then Unity and Visual Studio, and now he's kind of learning a little bit more about C# and Python. Yes? Is this true, Oshin? Yes, no? He's like, yes, gritting teeth. So anyways, hopefully you guys can support them as they continue in their journey starting to learn tech. So what I thought I would do today is kind of bring you guys through what I talked about at the MVP Summit last week, sans a few, and NDA slides from there. But basically what I think about kind of day in, day out is how can we really make it so that you as developers can focus on the code that only you can write. You're the only ones that actually have the context on the business that you're in, but everything else that's boilerplate or that's repetitive or that somebody else could be building, we want to build that for you, or we want the community to build that for you so that you can really focus on the code that's unique to your organization. And so I think there's one thing that's happening now, which is that the cloud and AI is actually starting to kind of transform the way that the developer experience is actually being delivered. And so when I think about kind of my job, I've been working in, sorry for the feedback, I don't know if we can turn down the volume a little bit.
Maybe switch off the microphone here for the audience. I think you have a
I have enough of a voice? Okay, so which one's for the audience?
This one.
Okay. There we go. There we go, thanks. Can you guys all hear me in the back still? Okay, great. Yes, okay. So when I think about my job, I've been working at Microsoft now since 2001, so it'll be 22 years this summer. And I've always been working on behalf of developers. I've worked on everything from programming language designs to API design in .NET to working on debuggers and the code editors in Visual Studio to working on Visual Studio and VS Code. And when we started working on TypeScript, I was involved in that. To our application platform, Azure App Service, our functions. But really what I want to focus on and what I've really kind of devoted my career towards is just thinking about how we can make developers bring their creativity to bear as quickly as possible. I really spend all of my time thinking about how we can really shave off every second in your inner loop and making you guys all more productive every 5 minutes. What percentage of time can I actually make you even more productive so that you can go from the speed of thought that's happening in your brain into the code and actually be able to deploy it. And so one of those dimensions is really kind of focusing on how you guys can do more coding and less kind of operational toil. So more dev, less ops in some ways. And so that's kind of one of the themes that you're going to see here. I think we're going to both transform the developer experience through the power of the cloud that you'll see in my talk, as well as the power of AI. So you're going to see that really kind of shown here. I'm very happy to make this interactive as we go through it, so feel free to raise your hand, ask a question, whatever. I will do my best to answer your question, but in some cases it might be that it's too, there's some particular topic that I'm not well versed in which case I'm happy to follow up later. So just in terms of kind of the agenda, there's so much for us to talk about, but I just want to give you guys a little bit of an orientation on how I'm going to orient this talk so that you can kind of figure out, follow me along. I'm going to start with how we make the individual developer more productive. So if you think about your individual dev inner loop and how you go through that edit, build, debug cycle, how can we actually improve that experience? Then we'll talk about basically what it looks like to develop in a team, cloud-based development, how we can enable better DevSecOps as part of team-based development. Then, I recognize a lot of you guys work in open source communities or lead open source projects. We'll talk about what we've been doing to support open source projects at a community level. Then I'll talk about the application platform. So the first 4 sections are kind of focused on how you write the code, but the last section will be focused on the code that you write and the building blocks that we have to help you write that code. Make sense? Okay. So first, let's start with productivity and AI. I think, like I said, it's really what we want to focus on is how we can make sure that you can go from that idea to your fingertips to the code that you want to write as quickly as possible. And one dimension of that is making sure that you can stay in the zone as a developer, right? This flow state, that you can actually kind of reach that we sometimes call it Zen mode in VS Code, actually. But we have this idea that basically you can get to this heightened state of engagement with the project that you're actually working on, and how can we get you to that state much faster? So we need to make sure that developers are supported to get into that state, but also that when you have a new team member join the team, how can we make it so that the cost of onboarding that new team member, whether they're a junior developer or somebody who's experienced from the industry, can get the context of the code that you've been working on as quickly as possible and make meaningful contributions to that code base. I just remembered that most of you guys probably don't have English as your first language, so should I be talking a little bit slower? No? Okay, good. Cool. So I think the first dimension that we want to talk about is that AI is going to really transform the developer experience over this next decade, no question. And I'll show you some demos just to prove that point in a second. But one of the things that we've found by working on GitHub Copilot, which is an AI pair programmer, so that you can actually kind of have an AI assistant as you're writing code that can actually do the statement completion for you and even write whole lines, functions of code, or even multiple functions based on the intent that you have expressed, either through a natural language comment that you've written at the top, through an interaction in the code editor, or by inferring from the code that you've already written what's likely going to be the next set of lines of code that you're going to be writing. Now, this is available as a GitHub service, but it's available in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. It's also available in the JetBrains IDEs and Sublime Text and other code editors if you don't happen to use Visual Studio. And it's also available to every organization. So whether or not you're using GitHub as your hosted source code solution, you can actually use GitHub Copilot, even if you're using, let's say, Bitbucket or you're using Azure DevOps. One of the things that we find is that folks who are using this tool find that they self-report, 55% of them self-report that they're faster at coding, that they feel that they are more fulfilled, 75% of them are more fulfilled, and 46% of them, that what we see is that now 46% of the code that was written is now written using the assistance of the AI pair programmer. So with that, I just want to do a quick demo of this. Hopefully the sound will work. No. Let me try this. Do you know how to get the sound to work? Because that's going to be hard. I can speak to these things. But what? No? Okay. But what you're seeing here is that that basically, in this case, I think a second ago, we just helped you debug the program that you were writing, that it can actually help you learn different concepts in different programming languages, that it's available in your favorite editor, that it's integrated into the workflow as you're trying to write the code, and even to the point that we have integration with our docs so that you can take a doc repository and have it ingest and understand that doc repository so that you can onboard developers more easily. That just showed you the PR experience in terms of if you create a pull request, it can actually be the first reviewer for that pull request so that you don't need to have another developer do that first code review. It can actually give you feedback on that first code review. Hopefully the other ones have sound. That video might not have had sound. How many of you guys are coding in VS Code today? Okay. And how many in Visual Studio? Cool. So I have something for you Visual Studio folks as well. We're also bringing it to Visual Studio. Hopefully the sound will work for this one. Nope. Shoot. That's no fun. I don't know why it's not working. But what you're seeing here is that basically we're asking Copilot to write something using natural language in the context of Visual Studio to actually explain the code. And in this case, it's actually asking, what is this class doing? And then you can end up with a natural language description of what the class is doing. This is the AI actually creating it. And it's even suggesting additional questions that you might want to ask about the code base. Based on that, you can then ask further questions in this kind of chat window that's still using natural language, but with the intelligence of your code base. And then it can kind of explain what that code can do, and then even generate code for you to use that API. And then you can even go ahead and incorporate it directly into your code base. So this took it from the chat window and brought it into the Visual Studio editor right now. So then it can also help you do things like error handling. So now we can ask what is going wrong in this case, and it's suggesting all the different kinds of exceptions that could be thrown based on the code that you just wrote. And you can even ask it to then generate code based on the exceptions that are likely to be thrown. And so what you can see now is we can actually update the code again to then incorporate these kinds of error checking and even generate unit tests for the function that I just created. I think this might be the last one. There might be one other dimension where we're, yes, fixing an exception. So the other thing that we want to think about is how we can actually guide you through the process of debugging your code. So in this case, we have a stack trace, and it's taking the context of the code that you've already written, plus that stack trace, to help you in natural language figure out how to navigate what went wrong and make recommendations for how to fix that issue. So now I can go ahead and take that, check for that particular error state, and incorporate it directly into the code base that I was writing. Silence. Interesting. How many of you guys have used Copilot thus far? A few of you. Well, I highly encourage all of you guys to go check it out and start using it. Not all of these features that I just showed you here are available right now, but a lot of them are, especially the chat window is kind of coming soon. For most people, some people are on the early adoption wait list for that. And the inline code using natural language is already available today. So you guys can all start using this tonight, or tomorrow at work. All right. Yeah, go for it.
Do you think it can go too far? That, like mobile phones, we all love them and things, but they tend to make us have bad habits and not communicate with people like we used to, not memorize things.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, one of the big questions that we have is really how is the act of coding going to end up changing over time because of this? And how are the social dynamics of kind of team environments going to change? I think, one of the things that I see, and one of the reasons why we started on this path in the first place, is we see kind of I was just talking with one of our engineering managers of VS Code this morning. We were talking about the challenges of adding new team members into the team. And one of the things that we see is that when a junior developer joins a development team, they are often really, really gun-shy to go and create their first PR. And then once they do that, they get a bunch of comments from the team, and then they become even more gun-shy to then create another PR. And so they end up kind of being very shy about talking to the more senior developers about kind of, what is their guidance around the kinds of code that they should be writing. I think this kind of assistance can really help onboard new developers into your code base much more easily. And also, I think it's going to remove some of the burden from the senior developers in terms of supporting the more junior developers. But the other thing with that is that you also end up with perhaps less interaction between the junior developer and the more senior developer, because they're going to consult the AI first before they reach out to the more senior developer. So we have to kind of think about, like, how do the dynamics of AI really and team environments change, and how do you kind of create more human-to-human collaboration in addition to this amazing tool that we have here.
I was also thinking, just for the single person, that, for example, handwritten notes are often said to be better than using a keyboard or taking pictures.
Yeah, in terms of
there's a better learning when you have more direct feedback.
Yeah.
So sometimes maybe you want to switch it off.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say that, I think when I'm learning a new API, that writing the code the first time you learn the code base, but it's not until you step through the code and you actually go through, different levels of the stack to execute it that you really start to understand how the code actually works. So I think it's probably similar in terms of, as the AI generates larger and larger amounts of code for you, I think, there's this question of how do you actually kind of ingest and understand the code that has been generated? How do you test it? How do you create unit tests for it that give you the confidence that it's the same quality of code that you would want to write. But also for learners, if you're learning a new API, how can you understand what it's doing? The challenge today is the only thing that you can do to learn what it's doing is to actually step through it and watch it execute. With this, you can actually ask it to summarize, and it can be extremely dynamic based on the code that's in the code base. Other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, maybe by using these AI assistant, an additional thought was you should not write a whole bunch of text or code.
Yeah.
But the API should get simpler, or your code should be expressive, and it's tricky to do this with AI because it's mainly bound to your domain knowledge.
What's kind of interesting about it is you can ask the AI to look at an existing body of code and ask it to rewrite that code in a way that's more readable to other users. You can ask it to write the code in a way that's more performant. So there's all these different kind of subsequent prompts that you can initiate to the code based on the code that was already generated or code that you wrote to continue to augment it. And so I think this is also another way that people can learn about kind of best practices on how to optimize code or how to make it more readable. And then the other thing is it can also, because it's inferring based on the code that you've already written, it can actually go and infer the best practices of your code base and your team's code base. And so, what we see is that it depends on the study, but between 25 to 60%, which I know is a huge range, but it's still a significant amount, of PR comments are based on stylistic differences, not on functional differences. And so if you just think about the idea that this could give you the feedback of the stylistic differences of how your code relates to the other code in the code base, that could eliminate that whole category of stylistic differences, that could lead to much better productivity for developers. Go ahead.
Does it read things like the editor config?
Yes, it does. Yes. So, and that's also something that I think we can continue to improve over time. Like the fact that you need to have an editor config, I think that's a good question over time. Do we need you to declaratively describe the editor config? Could we infer the editor config based on the existing code that you've already written so that we can actually standardize on code styles without you having to write an editor config? Because oftentimes writing those is kind of an advanced art. All right, ready to move on? Okay. So the next kind of big thing that's coming is cloud-based development. So, when we think about moving workloads to the cloud, we've been all focused on moving application workloads to the cloud, either by moving them from on-premises hosted hardware into cloud-based hardware. And oftentimes that's just done at the VM layer, at the IaaS layer. Other times we slightly update the code so that it's really cloud optimized, and we deploy it instead to the PaaS layer via a source deployment or something like that. But one of the workloads that has really not yet migrated to the cloud is the dev workload itself, right? If you think about it, I would imagine that most of you guys have a tower under your desk that is your development box. And you might have a lab that you have other developer boxes and VMs in, or you might not. You might be limited to just that one developer box or that one laptop in terms of being able to host the code that you're working on. What's cool is this idea that you could actually have developer workstations and developer workspaces hosted in the cloud as a cloud service. And so our vision, our aspiration, and we're making this a reality for engineers inside of Microsoft. I also run the team that works on the engineering systems across all of Microsoft, is to be able to set up a complete engineering system in seconds. And when I say complete, I mean not just hosted source code control, but also the CI/CD, the continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines for that code base, but also in a way that's secure and is also compliant to your organization's requirements. So whether that's, SOX compliance or all different kinds of dimensions of security checks that you have to do, that you can set that up in seconds, that you can contribute from any device, and that includes not just your laptop, but also if you think about the fact that everybody has moved from being hosted in an office space to now many of us work remotely all the time, and many of us are not working from our home offices. We're working from the local Starbucks or the Springly in Switzerland, I suppose, because you guys do have a lot of Springlys, huh? But you can imagine when you're on a public Wi-Fi that kind of freaks out your CISO. It freaks out your security officer in your organization. And so what the security officer loves about this is they can actually go and kind of look at what's happening on the developer workstation, so that they can have the confidence that customer data isn't being exfiltrated or other things like that. They can control the network that your dev box is attaching to. And you can also connect from a variety of different devices. So one of the big benefits of this is you could have a low-powered or a mid-powered laptop, but still connect to a many-core machine that's hosted in the cloud or something that has GPUs that might not be available on your local hardware. And then build for any platform. Part of our DevOps solution is to make sure that you can build for iOS and Linux and Mac and Windows and you name it, AWS and GCP, you could do with all of our tools. Collaborate with anyone with confidence. I think, nowadays, open source is becoming used by almost all organizations. 90% of new projects today start with an open source reference from the get-go. By the time they ship, 99% of modern applications have an open source reference in their code base. And so what this means is that you're collaborating not just with your local team, you're also collaborating with everyone who is in that supply chain, that software supply chain, which could include developers in the open source community that made a contribution to that package that you took a dependency on. And then you can scale without limit, that you don't have to make upfront choices that will kind of box you in and prevent you from doing that down the road. Now, one of the things that we introduced a couple of years ago now is GitHub Code Spaces. How many of you guys have heard about GitHub Code Spaces? Yes? How many of you guys are using GitHub Code Spaces thus far? So a lot of you, I know you guys have. So GitHub Code Spaces is fantastic. It's basically a kind of a Linux-hosted workspace it's essentially a SaaS service for your workspace. So via the Visual Studio Code client, rich client, or via the browser, you can basically connect your coding environment to a workspace that has a full Linux shell, that has the context of the GitHub repo that you've been working on, that is optimized for your use and doesn't spin, a VM or other kinds of compute resources when you're not using it. So it's really optimized from a cost perspective based on that interactive use time. Now, with this, we actually brought the development time to set up a dev box for the GitHub team from 45 minutes to less than 1 minute for the GitHub team to contribute to github.com. So I just ask you guys, if you think about a new team member joining your team, and you think about dev box setup, how long does that take? For how many of you guys does that take longer than a whole day? Yes? Yes. I think for many, it takes sometimes a couple of days to get that environment perfectly set up. We all know that the Python runtime, just as an example, is really hard to get properly set up. And so, people can spend a whole, portion of a boot camp, a 2-day boot camp. They might spend the whole first half day just setting up the dev box. If you can take that, precious time of, a 2-day boot camp and reduce that down to just a couple of minutes instead of 4 hours to set up the dev box before you can start learning, that's dramatic, right? And then if you need to do that, the thing about developers is it's, I think many people who are not developers think about the time that it takes to set up your machine is maybe a once in a career or once in a job task. But for developers, we're doing it all the time because I have to go create a new branch to check out that that bug that was reported, or I'm working on multiple projects at the same time, or I have to support an old piece of software that my company had been working on in addition to the major project that I'm working on. And so you actually need to go create multiple different instances of this. So the fact that we can bring this down significantly saves a tremendous amount of time and onboards a lot of developers much faster. So our goal with virtualizing the dev box is to make it really easy to create a new developer environment, but also make it so that you can approach it with the tools and the settings that you know and love, right? So you can use your VS Code settings in code spaces, so it really feels like it's customized to the developer environment that you've kind of tuned for your user experience. GitHub Codespaces is fantastic for when your source code is hosted in GitHub, when you're targeting a Linux workload, and you know, obviously you're working on something that's like a cloud native style application. But if you want to create something that's based on a Windows workstation, like either you're building a Windows client application or you have a dependency on another Windows machine, another Windows application as part of your development process, or your source code is not hosted in GitHub, then that's when Microsoft DevBox comes in. So you can think about Microsoft DevBox as being essentially a, it's like Cloud PC. How many of you guys have heard of Cloud PC? Yes? Maybe a few. Very small number. Okay, so think about basically the idea that I can take a VM and I can design it so that it can be optimized for a certain worker's use, right? Let's say if I'm a business user, I might use Excel and I might use Power BI and other things like that. We can actually create an environment that can be hosted in Azure that is optimized for that business analyst's use case. This is now the equivalent of that for the developer use case. So what this means is that you can quickly set up Visual Studio or any other dev dependencies that you might have to have a really productive developer workstation, but now hosted in the context of Azure. Now, the really great thing about this in a lot of ways is not only is it ready to code and you can start to use it super easily as a developer, but from an IT management perspective, it looks like any other device that is hosted by endpoint management. So if you know what they're already using in terms of Intune and managing all of the Windows PCs that are deployed inside of their environment, this now also plugs into that without them having to change anything. So with that, let's just show you guys a quick demo. And again, apologies that the sound isn't going to work, but I will try to speak to this. So imagine that I'm brand new to a team. And this is the, okay, great. So I'm brand new to the team. I got a mid-range, laptop assigned to me, and I need to start working on a project. I now get an email from my boss that says, hey, I set up a developer box for you. Go check out our developer portal and go start creating it. Now what I can do is create my own dev box, and then I can use the standard image that was created for my development team, and then I can actually open this in the context of the browser. Now this is using a browser window to access a full Windows PC with full Visual Studio in it. In this case, we're developing the equivalent of a AAA game using C++. And so what I can do here is connect to this environment so that I can then do that further development, incorporating all of the network settings that I might need for my particular corporate firewall. And then from there, I can use, it just plugs into using a standardized image for how you might describe that developer environment that uses the JSON description to do that. And then I can also create different DevBox profiles for different types of tasks inside of my team. So the first one I showed you was working on the game front-end development. This one is optimized for a data analyst role and uses the SQL tools to actually look at some telemetry pipelines. And so you can customize these different kinds of environments for different types of roles that are inside of your organization. And then further, from a cost management perspective, these actually also can be managed to hibernate when developers are not actively interacting with this DevBox. So it also saves costs from the perspective of like what is required to be able to support that developer. Not only do you not have to have the VM running all the time when the developer is at home, that doesn't need to happen, but you also don't need to necessarily have the hardware expenditure to be able to stay up to date with the latest, chipsets that you want to be able to use in your developer environment. Go for it.
What's about the licenses of additional software? For example, if I use Rider, how is it going?
It's a bring your own license kind of model. So if you already have a license for Rider, you can bring that to this environment as well.
Generic image where the license is not...
So it's basically customized for you and your engineering team. So once you create the first initial DevBox image for your team, then you can install Rider. You could have scripts that could update those images that are particular for each user that could basically run at the kind of initiation time so that they get their specific license, incorporated into that image once they start to use it. But I think, go ahead.
Can you customize the hardware? For example, some libraries they prefer NVIDIA over AMD.
Yeah, so that's definitely coming. So right now we have essentially like different numbers of CPUs supported from a SKU availability perspective. Essentially, it's 8 cores and up. So you can go as big as all of our Azure SKUs go. We don't yet have GPUs available for Microsoft DevBox, but it's coming. So it's just not quite there yet. But the idea that if there's limited hardware, that you might be able to access certain categories of hardware from a virtualized Azure hosted environment before you can actually get it locally, that's a reality that is coming to everybody. You guys seem very quiet. Am I going too fast? Am I doing interesting stuff?
Speaking in Switzerland, that's normal.
Okay. Well, hopefully this is useful and interesting to you all. Yes? Okay.
I have a question.
Go for it.
How much is it per month or per user?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, so he was just asking what's the price point on it, and what's the kind of like consumption rate. So essentially what we have with DevBox is, it's somewhat complicated and we've spent a lot of time on this, but essentially what it is that it's what we want to encourage is that people over time move towards an ephemeral use case. And what I mean by that is that you create a DevBox that's for a specific task. And so what we have is essentially a kind of rate model that goes like this in terms of the curve. So essentially, if you have a DevBox that's going to be long in lifetime, then it ends up being a fixed price for that month after you pass 80 hours. But if you're less than 80 hours, then it's on a consumption-based rate. So if you only use that DevBox for 4 hours, you only pay for 4 hours. And if you use it for 80 hours or more, you're not going to exceed a certain rate.
But is it, for example, if I have a VM installed with Visual Studio and the DevBox, I hope DevBox will be cheaper because of hibernation.
Yes, that's what we hope too. That's what we hope too. I think it obviously depends on the hardware that you're comparing it to, and then.
One-to-one, the same.
But that is our goal. And by the way, like just speaking to Microsoft's own internal use of this, we think that this is such a significant cost savings to us that we are rapidly migrating a ton of internal Microsoft developers to this solution. So thus far, we have migrated, like, I think it's like 10,000 developers to be hosted in Microsoft DevBox. I expect by this summer we'll be at 20,000, and by this time next year we'll probably be, you know, in the 40,000 range of internal Microsoft developers using this solution. And that just started since January. So very, very rapid deployment. Yeah, go for it.
Just thinking about updates.
Yeah.
So when, let's say I'm in project business.
Yeah.
And I have a VM for every project or a DevBox.
Yeah.
I don't use it for a year or so and I have to do a patch.
Yeah.
Fire it up again. Is it already updated or do I spend the first day to update all the stuff?
Update your machine, yeah. Oh, sorry. So his question was, let's say I have a project-based DevBox that I have for, I'm a consultant and I, you know, worked on a project last year and then there's a support ticket that comes in next year and I haven't worked on that project in a year. Do I spend, you know, the first 7 hours of trying to work on that solution updating my DevBox? All of that is configurable. So what we're trying to do is to use the Azure Image Builder service to basically create the images for you in a dynamic, programmable way. So essentially what you can choose to do is to invoke that Azure Image Build service as often as you want so that you can amortize the update costs as you need. It is, you know, the good thing is it's managed by Intune, so it will be able to get your, you know, security settings and everything that your organization has decided. Obviously, if you're an independent consultant, like it's you, but you know, that's a good way to kind of make sure that you're getting the latest updates according to your organization. And then how often it wakes and rebuilds the image or uses the image builder to create a derivative image or an update to that, that's up to you. The other thing that's, I think, super compelling about it is because it's using Azure Image Builder, we can have different levels of the images that we're trying to create. So we can have the base OS portion of the image that can be updated, and then the rest of it can basically layer on top. So,
Even get an updated visuals to be then if I choose the right layer.
yeah, so that's one of the big dimensions of this is, you know, we want to make this as managed of a service as possible so that we basically manage the update process so that you don't have to. Yeah, go for it.
What's the network requirements? And do you need a really good network connection, or does it work okay with mobile connections?
It's a good question. You know, definitely you know, definitely latency is something that we think about a ton in this. Mobile connection, I think it probably depends on the mobile connection that you have, certainly. But, you know, we are certainly looking to make sure that it works. Like we do, because the UI of the code editor is still remoted and hosted in the cloud. It is beneficial from a latency perspective to have that be co-located as best as possible with the end user. I think that's where we are today. I think over time, we can actually solve some of the problems that we're seeing there so that you're going to have even less bandwidth to be able to get great performance. But it's good enough now that we have, you know, like I said, thousands of developers using it, super satisfied inside of Microsoft already. You had a question?
It was regarding the latency too. How do you face that issue in the future? Do you use different protocols than RDP?
No, actually, what we're looking at doing over the longer term, but we'll see if this pans out, is moving towards more of a hybrid architecture model for Visual Studio itself, so that the code editor can actually be running locally in, you know, your client, and that then interacts with the more kind of less interactive pieces of Visual Studio that are hosted remotely.
Spaces, right?
Yeah, exactly, similar to code
Maybe
spaces.
you use Rhino?
Yeah, You can use Rider, but if you use Rider, no, that won't work unless Rider does optimizations. But if we did this kind of thing, it would be at the Windows API level, so Rider would be able to do the same approach that we would take. All right. How am I doing so far in terms of, we still have a ton of more content to get through, so deployment environments, the dev boxes are great when you're ready to virtualize the dev box, which works for traditional client-server applications. It works for rich client applications. But if you're building a cloud-native application and you have dependencies on cloud resources, you also need to instantiate the cloud resource for your dev test stamps, right? And that can actually be a little bit of rocket science to folks who aren't kind of super well-versed in DevOps engineering. And so one of the things that we've been working on is called Azure Deployment Environments. Again, apologies for the next demo not having sound, but essentially the idea is that we can create a sandboxed environment that allows you to create, using GitOps operations and what happens in your Git workflow, create the DevOps pipelines, but also instantiation of the Azure resources to create an on-demand environment for not just your application, but also the dependencies that you might have, like a managed database or another service like a front door service or something like that that you might need to use to be able to test out that dev test prod environment. So with this, I will speak for Scott. He's saying basically what I just said in terms of the fact that you if you have a dev box, you're trying to virtualize it, you need not just the dev box, but you also need to have the Azure resources that you're also trying to work on. So what we'll see here is we're talking about a mobile application, and in this case, this mobile application is not just a MAUI front end, but it also has a managed database on the back end, and it has an Azure App Service container environment with the application in there. It has different kinds of clients for MAUI. It's using a storage account, and we have different managed databases that we're also trying to use in this application. And we have SignalR and App Service that are all part of the application that we've built here. Now, creating and instantiating all of this for every developer on the team is pretty thorny. And so the question is, how can you do this in a standardized way across the platform engineering team? So essentially, you would have a platform engineer who's somebody who kind of works on your developer experience, uses a dev box to create a specific environment for developing that podcast application. And it can set up basically like the test environment for this podcast application. And so Azure Deployment Environments basically has three different things. It has the GitOps, as I talked about it, in terms of being able to kind of read from your Git operations to figure out kind of what pieces need to be instantiated. It has RBAC controls, and it has a way of tagging resources so that you can track them on projects. So now what's happening is we've created the DevBox environment, but not only that, we are also going to go and create the other resources that your application depends on. And so what you've seen here is that it's actually instantiated all of the Azure resources that this app needs for the test environment. So you now see, the SignalR, you see the container environment, you see, the feed queue and all of these other services instantiated as part of this test environment. And you can redeploy an instance or delete it if you no longer need it. And so then I think we're going to go into the GitOps flow, if I remember correctly. So now we're in GitHub, and this could be Azure DevOps as well, works with both. We're going to create a new branch. And because it's hooked into our GitOps operations, it's going to also, as a part of the CI/CD process, create all of those resources that I need to actually deploy my application into that test environment. So what you can see here is it created this environment. It has all of these environment resources. And here's the application and the web URL that I've just deployed it to, with all of the backend services also instantiated and populated and ready to be used. So this just makes cloud development so much easier because you don't need to be a rocket scientist in terms of, in terms of Azure or in terms of DevOps to be able to get this to work. So now what you can see is when I make a change to the code base and I initiate update, that it just runs my CI/CD environment and then redeploys to that test environment that I had just created. So there's creating the clone environment. And then it has the access control. So the cool thing about this is that as a platform engineer that's central in the organization, I can actually set which engineers are permitted to instantiate which kinds of Azure resources. So this means that I don't have to give permission to everybody to create all different kinds of Azure resources inside of my subscription. I can actually limit who in my organization has access to create this type of resource, and that it only can be created in the context of creating a test environment for this particular application. And then lastly, I can tag it so that I can actually look at, from a cost center perspective, which project was this associated with. Cool? Go for it. Yes, in fact you can. It's all basically driven off of GitOps. So you can really create you can augment the GitOps scripts that basically invoke all of these different APIs in Azure deployment environments. And so if you wanted to create, let's just say like a review, review website instantiation for, let's say you want your, CEO to see like the update to the UI of the front page or something like that. You could certainly do that as part of your GitOps flow. Go for it.
You do something like that with the bicep templates configured. How is this really different from that? How is it the experience compared to
the awesome thing is
the bicep templates?
It's all based on that. So the cool thing is, Bicep is based on ARM, and so it has the full instantiation of everything that you can do in ARM. This is using Bicep plus the AZD CLI, which I'll talk about a little bit later, to basically help you so that you have a consistent developer experience across all of those different environments. But then it's just it's three things. It's GitOps, it's the ability to tag, and then it's the RBAC controls so that you can have access control for the different kinds of resources that you need to create.
Would it be correct to say it's a kind of management layer on top of
exactly.
managed Bicep templates?
Yes, it's almost, you can almost think about it as a management layer for dev test resources. But it turns out that if we do it for dev test resources, doing it for prod resources is no different. So, we designed it as something that's like a management layer for dev test resources, but it really works for all different kinds of things. If I wanted to create a new stamp for a new client, for example, that, let's say I'm a WordPress, expert, and I want to create a stamp every time I have a new client that I need to build a WordPress site for, I could use this as the way that I do it, and I could, because I have the cost center tagging, I could actually have client billing work through that cost center tagging. Go for it.
Can you integrate this with ServiceNow? Like somebody raising a ticket for this and then it is automatically...
Yeah, no question. This is all just based on GitOps. So insofar as Azure DevOps and GitHub actions are extensible, you could use the same extensibility points.
And are these providers available in Terraform?
So,
And that repeats the question.
sorry, thank you. So the first question that I just answered was, what was the question again?
Integration of ServiceNow with...
Integration of ServiceNow, and I was just saying you can use the existing extensibility points on Azure DevOps or GitHub actions to be able to do that. And then the second question, remind me one more time.
The second question is
Terraform, yes. So today this is Bicep. Terraform is coming very, 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 very shortly. So we will have Terraform in the next month or two.
There's an extension in Azure DevOps, which is for replace token. So replace token is also doing exactly the same thing. I can create multiple environments like in 5 minutes.
Yes.
How does this differ with the Azure deployment?
So he was just saying Azure DevOps has the replace token kind of capability. How is this different? The thing that's different in this case is that helps you in terms of the token that you need for a particular DevOps workflow. This actually creates the management layer for the Azure resources that your app depends upon. And so you could build this yourself. Yes, you could build this yourself if you wanted to. But it's
more like the infrastructure as a code blueprint, right, in a managed format, which is offering like Microsoft is offering. It's something like we have an app services, and the primary requirement of app services, like it's a web stack.
Yep.
We might be requiring a SQL database, and we will be requiring an application insight.
yes,
Notice that this is the basic
Yes.
requirement of an app service.
yes,
I create a blueprint out of my infrastructure as a code.
yes.
And that can be repeated.
Yes, exactly. Except that one thing that's important with this is today, the typical pattern is that when people create a blueprint for a particular stack, they have disjoint blueprints. They have a source code blueprint. They sometimes have a DevOps CI/CD pipeline blueprint. And then they might have a bicep file or an ARM file that they have to develop all three of these things independently. What this does is it actually creates a common pattern for how you can do that across all three of them, and it creates a much better WYSIWYG kind of experience for managing the access control policy for creating those kinds of things. So today, you as the engineering systems genius in your team have to go figure out how to do the on behalf of, kind of authentication on behalf of the developer that you're supporting. There's a ton of different stuff that's kind of like magic incantations of DevOps that you can do today, but it's a little bit rocket science for a lot of folks, and so this just makes it so much easier.
And this deployment of the Azure deployment environment, this is again over portal.
This is what?
This is again over Azure portal when I'm deploying this whole thing.
Yeah, so basically this is using kind of, so DevBox itself, one of the concepts that's part of DevBox is this idea of a dev center. And so you can think about that as almost like a construct that represents a team that's working on a particular project. So this uses the same kinds of concepts to the dev center concept to define a group. And then the interaction for it is in that portal environment that you just saw in the DevBox kind of portal. But then you could also use the Azure resources to look at kind of the Azure portal to look at the Azure resources. And then you can also use GitHub as the developer workflow or Azure DevOps as the developer workflow. So the individual developer only needs to interact with Visual Studio or VS Code and GitHub or Azure DevOps, but never has to see any of that portal interaction if they don't want to.
How does it handle environment drift? Like you modify those environments afterwards. Can you just reapply the deployment environments, or how does it work?
Environment drift in what sense?
Well, you start off with the deployment environment, and then people start modifying the resources, modifying the blueprint, and working on it. And then at some point, it kind of diverges from the original point of view. You want to come back to a standard, or at least have a way of kind of consolidating that. Is there something specific that deployment environments?
Well, you can manage that yourself in terms of how you incorporate that. Thank you, into the solution. There's different ways to approach that. Like you could say, for example, you have a very expensive managed database as an example. You want there to be one single, dev stamp that all of the development team uses. You want one single test stamp that all of the team uses, and you want one prod stamp. And you could incorporate that into the flow for Azure deployment environments. Or you could say every dev basically creates a new stamp of a lighter weight database, like Redis plus, MySQL or something like that. And so all of that can be automated as part of your GitOps flow. Cool. So coming back to kind of GitHub Codespaces and Microsoft DevBox, this is a little bit out of order. I just want to kind of make the point that these two services are complementary. And we see that, some organizations are actually adopting both because they have both kind of Linux-based cloud native solutions that they're trying to develop, and they have Windows client applications that they're trying to develop. The IT management for Codespaces is really just part of GitHub.com and what happens in the GitHub Enterprise Cloud. For DevBox, it's all managed through Microsoft Azure and Endpoint Manager. So that's kind of the difference in terms of the two approaches for both solutions. So security, that's kind of the next topic. So we talked about the flow. Obviously, with more and more applications using open source, one of the big things that starts to become a concern for a lot of organizations is how can they be confident about their software supply chain. And so what GitHub Advanced Security does is basically 3 different things. It does secret scanning, looking for secrets that are in plain text in your code base. 2 is code scanning, looking for known vulnerabilities in your code base that you have not yet responded to. And then dependency analysis with automated fixing of if you have a dependency on a package that has a known vulnerability, it can actually submit pull requests and other things like that to update your code so that you can respond to this super quickly. So this all works in the context of the GitHub flow. And this allows you to kind of identify any kinds of secrets or vulnerabilities or issues in the code that you've written. And it can highlight, that this particular issue is, maybe not a best practice. As an example, I think everybody went through the Log4j incident last year and had to go figure out all of their different code bases that were affected by Log4j. This is a great example of something that's actually going to make that a lot easier across the industry to respond to very quickly. One of the things that we are super excited about is that we'll also be bringing this to Azure DevOps as well. So if you're not using GitHub today, but you're using Azure DevOps, you will also have code scanning and secret scanning and dependency analysis in Azure DevOps. So next is kind of community. GitHub, obviously, incredible partnership across Microsoft and the GitHub organization over the last few years as GitHub has become part of the Microsoft family. We actually recently passed 100 million developers in the GitHub graph. I think that happened in January or February. This was probably 6 months at least earlier than we were expecting. So it's just been phenomenal, huge growth. We've had 413 million open source contributions in 2022. 730 million minutes of compute time was donated to open source projects each month. We have 2.6 billion contributions to GitHub open source public repositories each year. And then we have over 200 million private and public repositories overall. So one of the things that we've been excited to work on over the past couple of years is GitHub sponsors. And so one of the things that's super important in terms of the health of any kind of open source package that you work on is to make sure that the developers who are working on it can continue to work on that. Because if there's a security vulnerability in that open source project, or there's a bug fix that needs to happen or something like that, we have to make sure that those developers can be sponsored and supported to work on that open source component. And so this is a way to actually directly fund individual developers working on open source projects that work on these kinds of solutions. And one of the things that we just actually announced the GA of GitHub sponsors for organizationally funded sponsorships to developers. And so during the beta, we saw huge growth from direct funding from organizations like American Express and Shopify and Mercedes-Benz and even AWS. Have been contributing money directly to the open source community to support these different kinds of packages. And in 2022, almost 40% of the sponsorship came from organizations. And in fact, each organization-funded sponsorship averaged nearly 15 times more, delivered 15 times more to maintainers than individual sponsorships. So getting to the point where we have broad industry recognition that we need to be supporting our open source community and creating a vehicle for how we can do that is really an essential and important part of making sure that open source is, continues to be a super healthy part of our industry. Any questions or thoughts on that? I made my pitch. Hopefully you guys can go talk to your folks and think about what it might look like to sponsor the packages that you all depend upon. Is anybody not using open source in this room? Well, I know this is the .NET user group, so you're all using open source, I suppose.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Is Microsoft earning anything regarding that?
That is not, no. Our goal is really just to kind of support the open source community through GitHub sponsors. So it is certainly not viewed as a profit center. Yeah, I mean, might be a slight amount that we use to kind of fund the project itself, but in fact, I'm not even sure about that, so don't quote me on that. But the purpose of it is really just to make sure that the open source community can continue to stay healthy and get healthier. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the application platform. How am I doing on time, by the way? Good? Okay. All right. So, in a sense, software is a team sport, and if you think about it, in a sense, I know I'm in Europe, like you might think about the industry as the World Cup, right? We are all, it's not just that we are working on our own individual teams, but we're actually all collaborating across the industry on the solutions that we all take a dependency on. And so we've talked a lot about how you collaborate to build your code, but now let's transition and talk about the code that you actually write. So, one of the things that we really want to make sure, and I mentioned this at the top of the talk, is that you can code faster and work smarter, and that you can take your idea into the solution as quickly as possible, that you can code with confidence, that you can have the confidence that the code that you took a dependency on in open source is trustworthy, that the AI generated, that you understand, that you can anticipate the problems before they happen, and that you can have the instant impact on the solution that you're creating. We are constantly looking at how we can improve our developer tools and are constantly releasing updates to Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. But just as an example, in Visual Studio 2022, these are all of the things that we've released in dot releases in the last few months. Just a ton of new features constantly coming out. And our goal is that you don't have to read some kind of README or some kind of documentation to figure out how to use these things, that they just kind of surface themselves to you. And as Laurent was talking about in terms of the feedback or the suggestion feature or other things like that, we do seriously look at every single one of those every time we do iteration planning to make sure that we're prioritizing what is the most highly rated suggestions from the community. So, with .NET, I know this is the .NET user group, so I definitely want to talk about .NET a bit. Our promise and our vision for .NET remains the same, that, we have a unified developer platform so that developers can have the best-in-class runtime for all the different kinds of solutions that you might want to build, any kind of app that you want to build, whether that's a mobile application or an IoT application or an AI application, and be as productive as the most cutting-edge solutions that are out there, and also with the enterprise trustworthy that I think many of you guys have to be able to deliver for your organizations. In terms of the .NET momentum, we have actually surpassed 6.1 million .NET monthly active users. 48,000 people have contributed to the .NET code base outside of Microsoft in the past year, so just a huge amount of community support, and thank you guys all for those of you who have contributed to the .NET code base. And it, continues to be one of the most loved developer frameworks and the highest velocity OSS project. And one of the top, C# is one of the top 5 programming languages on GitHub. And that's just a testimony to the support that you guys all do in the community to support other developers using .NET. I do want to mention that we also use .NET a ton inside of Microsoft. And one of the things that we are constantly trying to look at is how we can really improve your app without you having to take any action. And so one of the most important ways that we do that is by upgrading, improving the performance with every minor and major release of .NET. And so just as some examples, the Microsoft Graph, which serves 70 billion requests per day. Just by adopting the latest version of .NET, they had a 37% improvement in their CPU performance, which reduced their operational costs by 91%. Just one great example. Microsoft Teams, which uses 50 projects, has over 700 APIs, had a 25% improvement in their CPU time and a 60% improvement in terms of their P99 latency. And so the reason that this is super important to us is not only does it keep Microsoft developers happy that they get these wins, but this is also translates to direct cost savings for Microsoft in terms of the services that we're delivering here. And so this is just an example of the cost savings that we're trying to deliver that then you guys all get to benefit from in terms of the .NET solutions that you're building as well. And so that's what we are constantly striving for. Now, .NET MAUI, is really supposed to be kind of what we're working on to deliver a single unified .NET experience across all these different workloads and application types, whether you're building, a mobile solution or a desktop or a hybrid solution, and that you have a super, super productive, developer experience. How many of you guys have coded with MAUI so far? Wow, I'm surprised. It's not very many folks. Well, you should definitely check it out. One of the features that I like the most is the hot reload capability, which basically brings kind of the productivity of what you might have experienced in web client development, where you can make a change to the JavaScript and see that be reloaded in the browser immediately and see that functional update immediately. We now have brought that to the .NET environment so that you don't need to do a full rebuild to be able to get that experience. You can now do that in any .NET workload, be able to make a change and see that be immediately reflected in your application without having to stop debugging. You can just continue to work on it. So the .NET MAUI momentum has been pretty strong. We've seen 636% year-over-year adoption. Now, I admit this is our first year, so that's part of the reason why it's such a massive adoption. But we've also seen 18,000 stars on GitHub thus far. Now, just to show you an example application inside of Microsoft that we're building on top of .NET MAUI, the Microsoft 365 admin app, which will be coming out super soon, is based on .NET MAUI and has a pretty fast and fluid kind of user experience in terms of the iOS application and the Android application that we deliver using that framework. Now, one of the other things that we're really trying to focus on is to make sure that .NET is also a great programming language and app runtime environment for cloud-native applications. And when I say cloud-native applications, I mean generally 3 things. They typically tend to be hosted in Linux in the cloud. They are typically authored using containerized technologies like Docker and things like that. And then they typically tend to have a microservices-oriented architecture. And so one of the things that we've been working on for .NET on Linux is to actually make sure that .NET is in the box in Ubuntu. And so we've been partnering with Canonical to deliver this with not just the fact that it's there, but also enterprise-grade support for x64 and ARM64, and that we have a chiseled container so that it's basically like what that means is the smallest container size that you could possibly have for the .NET workload that you're trying to support. Any questions on this so far? No? Go for it.
Why Ubuntu and why not
I think we're actually trying to target whatever are the most popular Linux distros. So, the fact that I'm highlighting Ubuntu here doesn't mean that we're not going after Alpine and other Linux distros. I think it's just based on numbers, which ones we see to be kind of the most popular across our user base. And then also, obviously, we have to do this in partnership. So there also has to be sponsorship from the partner as well. Okay. And then in terms of containers, we really want to make sure that the developer environment experience for building and deploying containers is a great experience for .NET developers. And so we have world-class tooling for Docker and container apps and the Azure Container Registry and everything into Visual Studio. And so, we also want to make sure that we have great container support in the .NET command line and the .NET SDK. And so all of that is, the containerized experience is also being built into the core of .NET so that if you're using, let's say you use VS Code to do your C# development, or you use Sublime Text or some other lightweight editor, that you can also have a great experience for building cloud-native applications. So then what the result of that is that all you have to do as a .NET developer to get this deployed is to run .NET publish in the command line and a few parameters, and then it just works. You can start to build that container that you need to build. You can make sure that the environment variables are set, and you can ultimately deploy that to any container runtime, whether that's on Azure or AWS or GCP or DigitalOcean or some other cloud provider that you choose. Now, when I think about kind of, Azure Cloud Native, I think about not just kind of the core of the Azure App Platform, which is all of these different compute solutions that we have here. And most of you folks are probably using our web app solution or our Azure App Service that we call it. But lots of folks are using static apps. Lots of folks are using functions and logic apps, and container apps is our newest solution for cloud, for containerized workloads. But I also think about the middleware that we support. And yes, we not only support .NET, but we also support Spring and Java. We run everything on top of Kubernetes so that you basically get the benefits of Kubernetes in terms of, your ops folks feel like they have the confidence that everything is running in Kubernetes, but you don't necessarily need to understand Kubernetes to be able to be productive, to build an app that's running on top of that infrastructure. We want to make sure that we support great observability, and so not only do we have support for Azure App Insights, we added a managed Grafana service with Prometheus in the last year. And we also support Datadog and New Relic and Dynatrace and a bunch of other application performance monitoring solutions as Azure first-class services inside of Azure. And then we've been working on making sure that we have all of the managed databases that you might need for your solutions. So not only can you host your SQL in your own VM, but you can also instead just outsource the management of that to us and run that as a managed service. And then, all of the messaging capabilities as well. And then we've also been trying to work on improving the reliability of your applications. As applications and solutions become more complex, as they start to become more cloud native with more dependencies, it's pretty hard to actually create something that delivers the reliability that you need. For example, if there's a, something that happens in production, like there's a failure in a particular data center, or your load is much larger than you were expecting. What is the failover? How do you respond to those kinds of changes? And so we've been introducing load testing capabilities and Chaos Studio to inject faults into your solution so that you can anticipate those kinds of changes and make sure that your app is resilient in the face of expected, unexpected things that could interrupt your service of your application. So I think with that, I am done. Let me just make sure. what's left. I was going to talk about Java for a second. I'm not going to talk about Java. Okay, so so in some senses, when we think about a solution, we need to build the code. We collaborate using GitHub or Azure DevOps so that I can interact with the other developers on my team. But ultimately, I want to have a CI/CD pipeline that then deploys to wherever I need to deploy that service. And we've been really working on making sure that we have fantastic support in GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps pipelines, so that you can do that CI/CD process as part of an automated aspect of your experience for your developer experience. But we also want to make sure that we have great experiences for getting started in Azure for all of you folks. So you can check out this github.com/Azure/actions to see a bunch of different examples. But I'm just going to show you one last demo here, which is these are all of the templates that we have out there that allow you to, example apps that you can go look at that have the source code, the Azure resources, and the pipelines fully integrated so that you can see examples of best practices on how to build solutions that are going to be deployed to Azure. Now, what you see here is this is using Azure YAML as a way to kind of create the bicep infrastructure for the deployment pipeline, but then you just use AZD up, which is the new Azure developer CLI, to do the actual deployment up into the Azure environment using the bicep files that you had created previously. So this is now deploying all of the services, and in less than a minute, you now have a working site, a simple to-do app that has been deployed in your environment. And then from here, I can barely see the screen, it's pretty small, apologies. Oh, this is just interacting with the app, but just showing you an example of kind of, how easy and quick it is to get a solution instantiated and then deployed into Azure using these templates. You can then go derive from these templates in your own organization to create customizations for what your organization needs to use. So definitely, if you haven't already, go check out the Azure Developer CLI. It's a way to kind of really simplify the developer experience for building against Azure, and then also a way to kind of standardize that across your entire development team. So I think I'm done. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I think it was really thorough and fantastic. So thank you so much for coming to visit us.
Of course.
We still have the room for a while, so feel free to stay, interact, network, and like I said before, there are drinks. And also make sure to thank iSolutions for their support. And have a good rest of the evening. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. And I'm happy to take any questions as well. All right. You are welcome to come up and ask me the questions.
That's the sweet way. They come after the talk to ask
Yeah,
questions.
exactly.
Yeah.